That literally makes me want to bang my head into a wall. That is so beyond upsetting.
Your wall looks nice, though. I like the wallpaper.
Yeah, I know. Thank you. I did this myself. It was very exciting. I know. I have other crappier walls, though, that I would bang my head into. Don't worry.
Okay. All right.
Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross, and I'm very excited today because I have Mike Latner with me, who's a professor of political science at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And we're going to be talking all about gerrymandering and what's been going on because Texas is in the news and threats are flying. Texas Democrats are fleeing. It's been a whole thing. But Mike, very happy to have you.
Thanks for having me. This sounds like it's going to be fun.
Yeah. All right. Most important part, what are we drinking?
So even though I'm a California native, I am going with a local favorite, the Imperial IPA, the Fiddlehead IPA.
Nice.
And it is this is the double, so it's a big boy.
Cool. Feels fitting. And I'm drinking Sierra Nevada Peachy Little Thing IPA. And I like it because this family owned, operated, and argued over. And that felt great.
I cut my teeth on Sierra Nevada. I did my undergrad at Chico State.
Exactly. So glad to bring it back. Anyways, cheers.
Cheers.
Oh, that's good. It's more refreshing than what democracy feels like. Okay.
Right now, especially.
Exactly. Mike, the question I always love to ask my guests is, why should we trust what you have to say?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I'm actually, I was trained as a comparative political scientist. So I did my PhD at UC Irvine. But over the last 10 years or so, I have been working in the space of redistricting. A number of co-authors, Tony McGann, Tony Smith, Alex Keenan, and myself wrote a book, Gerrymandering in America in 2016. After the 2012 gerrymandering, which was historically one of the nation's most extreme gerrymanders nationally. And then we followed up with gerrymandering the states in 2021. And so I've been working in the redistricting space and studying redistricting and gerrymandering for the last decade.
All right. Well, I'm very happy to have you. So to set the scene, what happened is Trump basically told Texas that he wanted them to redistrict and find at least 5 more Republican seats. And for people who don't know what gerrymandering is, you probably have a better definition, but just, the get-go. It is basically designing congressional districts in such a way that's going to give a certain outcome, right? And so it splits up certain people, splits up certain demographics, and Democrats do it and Republicans do it. Everyone is guilty of doing it. But it basically, they do it in different ways, but everyone's guilty of doing it. And it's now back in the news because generally it happens every 10 years when the census comes out. However, this is not a census year. This is actually directly in the middle. So this request is kind of cuckoo bananas. So, and and Democrats fled the state of Texas, House Democrats of Texas.
Yes.
Because they need a certain amount to be there in order to vote on it. And
they need a majority, a quorum. And so some are hiding in Illinois, some are hiding here in Massachusetts.
Some are in New York. Yep. And the House Republicans have voted for to put out warrants for their arrest.
Yeah.
So it's cool, easy breezy. Democracy is functioning totally well.
Exactly as designed.
Exactly.
That's right.
So gerrymandering, I feel like, has just become this learned helplessness, this just kind of bummer of acceptance for American democracy. And it doesn't feel like it should be. What's the background of it?
Well, so the act of gerrymandering is probably as old as the first legislative election. And what I mean by that is that anytime you have an election to an assembly, it becomes quite apparent pretty quickly that depending on where people vote and who they're voting with within an electoral district shapes the outcome, right? And so the oldest recorded discourse on what we call gerrymandering today goes back to the 1700s in the English Parliament, the House of Commons, where you had what people talked about rotten boroughs. And rotten boroughs were seats allocated to the House of Commons, and the communities, the places where members of parliament were elected from, they never changed over many decades. And so there were, I think in the 1820s or so, there were 88 or 89 seats that were elected to the House of Commons with fewer than 100 people in the district. And they were called rotten because they were thought to be easily corrupted, and the members could be basically bought by one of the wealthy landowners. And so the concept goes back a long ways, and it's not always associated with partisanship, right? So you can have gerrymanders that protect parties, and that's where the term that we use in the U.S. comes from Elbridge Gerry, and we can talk about that. But you can have gerrymanders that protect one racial group over another, or that protect incumbents over challengers. So there's lots of ways to cut districts so as to disadvantage one group and advantage another. And that's really the key. And in the U.S., that has really come down to both partisan and racial gerrymandering are the main features that we're looking at now. And so the term gerrymandering, 10 years ago, I used to have to give people a sort of elevator speech about what gerrymandering is before I started talking about it. I no longer have to do that, right? People sort of get gerrymandering because it's been so much part of the discourse of American politics over the last decade or so. And in particular, in Rucho v. Kamikaze, the Supreme Court of the United States basically threw their hands in the air and said, we can't adjudicate partisan gerrymandering. And so now parties are free, with the exception of moving into racial gerrymandering, which is still partially protected by the Voting Rights Act. But what we're seeing today with Texas just openly seeking to get 5 more seats out of their current plan, and then California possibly getting into some retribution. And so now we basically have a gerrymandering arms race going on between states to control the composition of the House of Representatives, something that the framers would certainly have been appalled at.
Yeah, I am like anyone, especially the Supreme Court, anyone who's on there who says they're originalist, and then and you're not trying to prevent gerrymandering, whatever. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. I feel fine about it.
Yeah, it's kind of
just
crazy.
Because I'm curious, what is the story of Jerry? Why is it gerrymandering? You mentioned it briefly.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really sort of sad because it's been the term has been used for so long and used wrongly, pronouncing the poor man's name, that he's sort of lost. So his name was Elbridge Gerry, pronounced Gary. He was the 5th vice president of the United States under James Madison, and he was governor of Massachusetts. And during his tenure as governor, after the second census after the 1810 census in 1812, new districts were drawn in Massachusetts. And back then, as today, the Federalists and Republicans, the two major parties, were competing for political power. And he signed off. He didn't actually design, but he signed off on a plan that had a very funky looking district outside in Essex County in Massachusetts. And the local, he was a Republican, the local Federalist newspaper mocked it and derided it as a salamander and referred to it as a Gerrymander. And that's where the term comes from. Poor Elbridge Gerry.
So we should really be calling it gerrymandering.
We should, but it's too late now.
It's too late. Sorry in the dialogue. Yeah. Sorry, Gary.
Way it goes.
But that's a not fun fact. So thanks for sharing.
That's right.
So what are your Texas is right. Redoing this in the middle of a census here is weird. It's not what status quo is, but to be fair, nothing is status quo these days. Has this happened before?
Absolutely. So we think of this as very unusual because it hasn't happened in a long time. It's fairly rare. But in fact, the last time that it happened, and it was quite controversial, was in Texas, when the Texas, the Texas Republicans from the House worked with the Texas legislature to redraw districts in, I think it was the 90s, I want to say, in the middle of the decade. And there were some consequences. The majority whip in Congress eventually went to jail, but not directly related for this. It was related for taking checks on the floor of the House, which is apparently still illegal. But basically nothing happened because of the gerrymander. There's no laws against it. Congress requires, and now the courts require, because of the requirement for equal population in districts after all the reapportionment cases in the 1960s, all jurisdictions, whether they're school districts or the state legislators or Congress, have to be redrawn to have relatively equal population between districts, so as to protect from malapportionment, which is when you have different populations in districts, the smaller the population, the more power that those voters have. And it was one of the many ways that black voters were disenfranchised during Jim Crow. And it has been outlawed, with the exception, of course, of the U.S. Senate, which is one of the most malapportioned electoral bodies in the world. But that's another story. So mid-decade redistricting has become quite rare. But actually, if we look back to the late 1800s, which was when we really first had the first sort of modern partisan polarized Congress, which we're sort of used to today. But back then, not only did states sometimes redistrict, they would at times just delegate and change their whole election structure. So they might change from districts to just electing all their delegates statewide and not even use districts. And many states didn't use districts at that time. And so, if they felt that they could get an edge up in the next election, then they might choose to use districts, or they might not.
So I guess it is, unfortunately, a relatively normal part of society these days. I would love for you to dive more into the ways that it's used to harm marginalized communities, because that's like a big part of it, and the history behind that.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I don't think people are talking enough about is that if Texas moves forward, which it looks as though they certainly are, which districts are going to disappear, right? Those are going to be primarily Latino and Black districts, right? Majority and minority districts in urban areas, in places like Dallas-Fort Worth and Houston, other metropolitan centers, where they're going to be carving out Democratic districts. They're going to be combining those urban populations with suburban populations where there's more Republicans. And what that means in effect is that they're going to be diluting the voting power of ethnic and racial minorities and language minorities. And they will do so to the extent that they basically run into the constraints of the Voting Rights Act. And why this is particularly unfortunate is that the Voting Rights Act itself is basically on the cutting board, because the Supreme Court just last week requested additional briefing information on a racial gerrymandering case out of Louisiana that they punted on this term, and they're going to be deciding next term. And so they are questioning the very constitutionality of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is the last remaining pillar of the Voting Rights Act that protects minority voters in this country. And so one of the reasons why Texas is able to be so bold is because they don't have the courts looking over their shoulder.
That literally makes me want to bang my head into a wall. That is so beyond upsetting.
Your wall looks nice, though. I like the wallpaper.
Yeah, I know. Thank you. I did this myself. It was very exciting. I know. I have other crappier walls, though, that I would bang my head into. Don't worry.
Okay. All right.
It's crazy to me that the Voting Rights Act is on the table. And because it feels like such like a fundamental part of righting the wrongs of American history that it feels like most people should be on board with, right? And the fact that
And
there's
they were for decades, right? I mean,
the
this
fact
was
that
a
it's just going to be,
bipartisan.
it's insane. It's
Yeah.
crazy. People have gone cuckoo, fully cuckoo.
Yeah, I mean, it's the consequence of partisan power, right? I mean, that's the stakes are so high that, I mean, the even the thought of redistricting so as to actually determine control of the House. I mean, it's one thing to, it's one thing to get a couple extra seats for your party. That's pretty normal politics. But what we're seeing now is really the amplification of this.
It's so blatant. It is kind of crazy because people like gerrymander, but kind of be like under the radar, like feel embarrassed by it in a way. And now, like, there's no shame.
That's right. They used to at least be ashamed. And the consequences, you were asking about the consequences. It's not just about descriptive representation, right? I mean, the control over state legislatures, obviously control over Congress. But when you look back at the last decade and you look at the effects of gerrymandering in terms of which states expanded Medicaid and did not expand Medicaid, looking at the response to COVID. So it's states that were extremely gerrymandered had much poorer responses to COVID, were much less effective and active in protecting their populations. And a lot more people died as a result. And so we are literally talking about life and death choices, the ability for people who are harmed by public policy and who bear the burden of public policy are the most underrepresented. And that's not a coincidence.
That's wild. It's fascinating. Unfortunately, it appears that the Voting Rights Act is on the table, right? But I know there's a couple of big cases that happened pretty recently in the Supreme Court that gutted one Voting Rights Act in a couple ways and also made gerrymandering a lot easier to do. Can you elaborate on that?
There's actually been a sort of whittling away of the Voting Rights Act. Going back to 2013 was really the first big axe taken to the act when the Supreme Court in a partisan vote declared that Section 5, which was the pre-clearance standard, they declared that unconstitutional. And so Section 5 was the part of the Voting Rights Act that required votes, the states that had a history of racial discrimination to pre-clear any changes to their electoral systems. They either had to be cleared by the Department of Justice or a federal court. And the Supreme Court in 2013 argued that treated states too unequally, and they basically sided with state governments over voters. And they said that this is too much of a burden on state governments. We're violating the equal treatment of states. And so, whack, you take out Section 5. That was a very big deal.
I don't know if you could tell, but my eyes were rolling so far in the back of my head that they almost got stuck.
Well, I mean, it really marked a fundamental change in the way that we govern in the United States, because the Voting Rights Act really represented a consensus between the branches of government. The legislative branch, the executive with the Department of Justice, and the courts all agreed that our nation's history of racial discrimination needed to end and that this was an effective way to start that process. And that consensus broke in 2013 when the court said, we're not going to be part of this consensus anymore. And since then, they have continued to whittle away. Brnovich v. DNC further weakened Section 2. And now with the question of whether racial data, right, race-conscious districting can be done at all is what's on the table now. Can we even consider racial data when we are drawing district boundaries? So the theory is that a truly racially blind process literally doesn't look at race data, right? And so now one might ask the question, well, if racial discrimination is the problem, how can we not look at racial data to know whether we fixed the problem or not? But the idea is that you've got to at least start with a racially blind process. And frankly, with single seat districts and the way that we represent Congress and the vast majority of state legislatures in the United States, that's simply impossible because single seat districts define communities of interest and that determines representation.
Is there a way to make like representatives and districts actually representative? Like in my mind, I'm like, okay, everyone votes, right? And so people who are like America's democracy, yes, it's a democratic republic, right? Republic meaning that people vote and then it's like put into one group, blah, 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 whatever.
And the government represents the people. That's the idea.
That's the concept. But like,
Yeah.
what if we just states, like they just took the popular vote, and then they just divided it up based on ideas?
Well,
I don't know.
Well,
That's
how,
not really
how
well
would they
thought.
divide it up? What would be your idea of dividing the popular vote?
They would do it after the fact. They would see like
Okay.
what locations are, more Republican or Democratic or like, other like factors that they take in. And
Uh-huh.
then they're like, okay, you guys get 7 seats. We're now
Yeah.
going to divide up based on after the fact. So that it is grouped together and people are voting in chunks that they generally want to be voting in, but it's
Right.
not advantaging one group over the other.
Yeah. So what you're basically describing is what we call proportional representation, right? That people's votes, so groups vote together for the candidates and parties that they want, and they basically get seats in proportion to the strength of their vote. And that is what most of the world does. So most of the world's democracies use some form of what I would call a permissive electoral system, what's widely referred to as proportional representation. And you have multi-seat districts, which we have a lot of in the U.S., even in some state legislatures. And basically, the percentage of seats that a coalition gets is based on the percentage of votes that they get. The simplest way to do that is you look at, Israel's not a great example to look at right now, but Israel, the Netherlands, right? The purest examples of PR, there are no districts at all, right? So the entire country of the Netherlands, the entire country of Israel is a single electoral district. You elect 150 seats or 120 seats, or in the case of the U.S. House, it would be 435 seats. And you just give seats proportionally to parties. And that means everyone's vote has the same weight. And it also, for this conversation, means that the whole process of gerrymandering, right, and all of the money, and both political parties are spending upwards of $150 million apiece every redistricting cycle. All that would go away because, it wouldn't necessarily go away because you'd still have large multi-seat districts, but essentially what we see in countries that use multi-seat districts is that it lowers the stakes, right? Because all parties are going to win seats. And once you have more than 5 or 6 seats per district, it's very hard to try to eke out an extra seat because there's more volatility. It's more difficult to predict how well parties are going to do. And so basically parties don't engage in gerrymandering because it's not worth it.
Is there any world in which that happens for the U.S.?
There's absolutely a world in which it happens. And I would remind your listeners that Winston Churchill's probably right here, right? He once said that Americans will always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And so that's sort of where we're at now, because we're clearly seeing I think it's safe to say that we're sort of at peak absurdity right now, where we are engaged in an arms race between states, that the only people that lose are the American people, because we're now allowing states to determine the composition of the House of Representatives is a clear violation of the framers' principles that there was supposed to be a separation of powers between the state governments and the federal government. And I would add that given the threats to the Voting Rights Act, that we may do away with race-conscious districting, those who are concerned about political equality in this country, and that includes many Republicans as well as Democrats and all sorts of folks in between, ought to be looking at these alternative forms of governance, which are not strange to the United States, right? We have semi-proportional systems in many city counties and school districts around the country, and we've used proportional representation before, so it's not like it's a foreign entity. And these solutions provide genuine representation. They work at least as well as single seat districts in most cases, with regard to the type of representation they provide. And they have a lot of other benefits. Turnout tends to be higher in PR countries. We have abysmally low turnout in the United States. There's a lot of reasons that we should be looking at multi-seat proportional representation.
It just feels more democratic because what's going on does not feel
democratic. It is more democratic. Well, yeah. I mean, no one would mistake what we're seeing right now as democracy, right? This is just warfare between parties.
Literally.
And it's not, and frankly, there are a lot of conservative Americans and progressives and people all over the place that would just like to have a better process, and a process that isn't exhausting us, which is what this
Everyone's so tired. Every such exhausted, tired person should get together and we should overthrow the system.
This is one area where I definitely would love to work myself out of a job.
Yeah, for sure. Is there anything else you'd like to touch on? This has been very informative and helpful.
I think, we just all have to be vigilant, and this is going to get worse before it gets better. It's hard to say what's going to happen with all of this gerrymandering madness. On the face of it, it looks like Republicans are going to win because even if there is an arms race, there's more opportunity, frankly, for Republicans than there are for Democrats because Democrats are pretty maxed out in the states that they do control. It's harder to change districting plans in the states that they control. California is probably the biggest bet where you could use the initiative process and just, put up an anti-Republican initiative that would pass just by virtue of, the strength of Democrats in the state. But Republicans have opportunities in Texas. They have opportunities in Ohio. There's more places on the map where they can gain seats. And so they'll probably win this war. On the other hand, it's not clear that that's going to be enough for them because all the signs are pointing to this being a pretty normal, if not strong midterm election where the president's party loses seats. And Texas and these other states that are trying to maximize their partisan advantage definitely risk creating what we call dummy manders. And that's when you stretch yourself too thin, the opposition has a good year, and then you get swept. And that's certainly possible.
Very interesting. Oh, yeah. And for people who are not aware, each state is different on how they go about this. There are some commissions, right? A lot of states have commissions that are bipartisan. In theory?
So there are bipartisan commissions, there are independent commissions, there are advisory commissions, and then, there are a lot of states that still do it the old-fashioned way, which is just let legislators carve their own seats out, which just seems absurd on its face. And that's a good point because there are more states that have done something about gerrymandering, and those tend to be Democratic states. And so it's not as easy for the Democratic Party to manipulate the process because they've already sort of fixed it in their states or tried to.
Which is always the thing that Democrats are struggling with, which is fighting back dirty because we put regulations on.
That's what good intentions get you.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, hard being trying to do good. Well, Mike, this has been lovely. Thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.